Hey everyone, this is Vivek Bharata. This is the second video in the Microservices Masterclass series. I covered the introduction part of the series in the previous video. Thanks very much for sharing your excitement via comments. Really appreciate it. In this video, we will cover the architecture overview at this stage and will develop an API gateway service, and also we'll have a placeholder service for auth service so that we can close the loop and test the API gateway service to some extent. Let's get started. As you can see, total there are 4 microservices and 1 API gateway service. We'll start with the API gateway service, and in the later videos we'll cover each service separately, or maybe 2 videos based on the complexity of each service. And each service will have their own database. For auth service, account service and transaction service, currently I'm going with Postgres database, and for notification service we can use MongoDB. Apart from this, we're using Redis to store auth information and also some transactions info to process transactions. And to support distributed transactions, we'll be using Kafka. And Kafka is not just only for this case, but as of now with the transaction service, right, it will be heavily used for transactions. This is a very rough gist of the architecture, and also apart from that, there can be so many other services in the banking sector like the payment service, ledger service, and so on. Based on support from the community and also the learning curve, we'll try to see how we can fit the other services, and we'll keep growing on this project. That's pretty much it on the very high level architecture overview. Let me know how you feel this architecture to begin with. And I'm also attaching a readme file in the repository, and it will be shared across. So the readme file at the root level will give you all the concise information like core services, API gateway port is 3000, which is an entry point for all requests, auth service is a 3001, account service 3002, and transaction service 3003. Apart from these microservices, we are actually relying on other supporting services like Redis, which is listening at 6379, and there's a Redis UI which will be available at 8001. And there's a very rough tech stack which keeps increasing and evolving down the line, and getting started you can just go through. Overall, that's pretty much it on the readme.md. Let's start with the overall folder structure. As of now, we have this Bruno folder which will be used for the REST client. We'll be using Bruno client, not the Postman. There are so many pros and cons. Let me know if you need a separate video for it. And apart from that, VS Code, self-explanatory. So there is an API gateway folder. There is a very boilerplate code I just added. I'll walk you through in that anyway. And apart from that, we have this assets to store some images and all, which will be again pointed in the readme.md file. And there's a base template service. The reason I created this one specifically because down the line we'll be developing more than 4 microservices, right? So for 4 microservices or any of the services, if it is being written in Node.js, then usually we'll be following with these boilerplate code like prettier C, ESLint, tsconfig, and all that stuff. And also dummy folder structure over here, middlewares, config, and types inside. Any Express.js based if you want to do it. And apart from that, middlewares as well. And app.ts as an entry point. And we have a git ignore which covers the basic files and folders. And we have this Docker compose which will again evolve. As of now, we are using only Redis, but down the line we'll be using Kafka and other microservices as well, right? So to get started, we'll just start with the Redis. And over here, Redis, if you see, we are using Redis stack where we can actually get the actual Redis server and also the UI part of it. That's why we are exporting 8001 where we can access Redis as a front end. And we are just having a Redis data volume separate just to isolate. That's it. Okay. And just to reiterate, as of now, we are having only Redis, but down the line we'll be having Kafka and all the other microservices also. So let's close this one. Okay, so let's start with the API gateway overall. So if you see here, there is again the same template, right? As you can see here, this is the same base template. From here, if you can compare source and all that stuff, right? Package.json I didn't explicitly add it, but we can add it. But more or less, we'll be copy pasting once we have the auth service, and from there we actually modularize in a way that will basically extract common elements like config, loggers, and all, and we will abstract in a way that we'll use it as an npm local package, and that same local package will be referenced across all microservices. That's a very fun part. I'll cover that in the later videos, but yeah, that's the rough picture. Okay, another point to highlight, my working style is basically we'll try to close the loop functionally, then we'll refactor. And during the refactoring, if we see that there is some commonality and if some functions that can be abstracted and so on, we'll just do it down the line. I am not the guy where I want to try the code in the first place as way too perfect, then later realize it's not perfect anymore. So always try to close the loop if you're working in any of the projects. Then on top of it, try to refactor and build on top of it. So always tries to close the loop. So that's the main thumb rule. I have this readme.md file inside the API gateway also will maintain each specific readme.md file for each service. So to start with API gateway service, so this is an API gateway service for the VBank microservices architecture. It serves as the entry point for all client requests, handling routing, authentication, rate limiting, and request forwarding to appropriate microservices. This is not just the only features that API gateway can provide. We can add so many other features also, but right now we can start with this one, and down the line we can improve, like we can add the monitoring and all of this stuff as well. So features, request and all, as you can see, this will cover through as a code, prerequisites and all that stuff. So npm install, you can copy paste the env.example and try to start. So this is a tabular notation of environment variables, like we have port, node env, or jwt secret, gateway jwt secret, and gateway jwt expires in. So these are specific to gateway. This will cover in this video only, like generating the token and passing down as a header to the following services. But once we cover the auth service in the later videos, then you'll get a better picture of it. Then later we have rate limit window, maximum request, default timeout, and the most important environment variables are at the end. If you see Redis URL, auth service URL, account service URL, and transaction service URL. So as of now, I didn't cover the notification service explicitly. That will add it later down the line when we progress. But as you can see here, auth service, which will be listened at 3001, account service at 3002, and transaction service at 3003. Simple. Okay. And we have some of the available scripts and all. That's it. The dependencies and all, we can just go through the package.json file. If you see here, we are using Express, and fun part, I did try to use Express5, though I did face some issues, but I think it's better to start with Express5 because down the line it might become as a main version, and if we start with 4, it will be outdated. This is also kind of a challenging because I did face some issues when I was using HTTP proxy middleware, but I think as of now it all settled, so should be fine. So we are using cars.env, express rate limit, helmet, HTTP proxy middleware. So this is the main core package we are using to basically proxy the requests, right? And IO Redis is for the Redis, JSON Web Token, it's a well known for the JWT signing and validation. And we have this Winston for logger and all that supporting TypeScript packages. That's it. Okay. Now let's start building the API gateway itself. So we'll begin with the source folder over here. Okay. And we'll start with app. This is the entry point, right? So if you see at the package.json file, we have this ts node source app.ts. This ts node dev is basically as a watch mode where it will recompile and start the service. That's it. Okay. And so let's start with the app.ts. We'll start with the very basic imports like .env and .env.config so that it just picks up. And .env is also ready. It's all internal. So I just copy pasted the same .env example, and the values are also same. Doesn't matter. It all runs in my machine. So I'm not going to expose this to a public servers. So should be fine. Okay. So in the app.ts, I have this very basic imports. Now let's start with the Express instance over here. And then later we can basically invoke the middlewares. App.use of helmet, which will basically add all the security headers and all. Most of the Express developers should be knowing about this one, and also course self-explanatory. We'll start with the default and eventually we'll customize it for our requirement. And we can have one simple health check endpoint. So whenever if you want to see whether the service is active, we can just start with this simple health check endpoint. And when we hit it, we just status okay. Simple. Okay. Before resuming this app.ts file, I just want to cover the other dependencies so that we can import those as well and try to close the whole loop. Let's start with the config folder. So inside config, we'll try to basically get all the env variables and store it as a config file so that it's easy to accessible, and it's like a single point of information where we can just access any of the environment variables with config.environment variable key. Simple. Okay. I'll just dump the contents over here, index.ts. That's it. Okay, I just defined an interface where it covers service name, port, default timeout, auth, JWT secret, all the .env variable values over here. Okay, and over here if you see, basically trying to return a full object with resolving the values from either process.env object, or for the service name, if you see, I'm basically trying to read the package.json and get the name, which will be, in this case, it will be API gateway. Okay. As we will be using the same nomenclature, the same config/index.ts file, which will be automatically derived. So for the auth service, we'll be more or less using the same config/index.ts file. So we don't need to really change this value. And And maybe we can extract this and make it as a common util file as well. So that we'll think through at the time and decide how we can improve on this one. So but for now, we'll just read the service name. We'll just need the name from the package.json and use that as a service underscore name. This I'll tell you where we are exactly using, but for now treat this as, okay, we are reading the name from the package.json and we are storing it in service underscore name. Port, again self-explanatory. We have this default timeout, auth JWT secret. So this specific key, auth JWT secret, will be validated. If you recollect the architecture, any request will go through the API gateway. So in the API gateway itself, we can actually authorize the request. Let's say if the token is there, if the header authorization token is not there, we can just send 401 unauthorized from the API gateway itself instead of sending the request to the actual auth service. Doesn't make sense, right? So most of the times in API gateway, we'll try to validate the private request, and if it is not valid, we'll just return 401 instead of actually routing the request to the auth service or any of the services, right? So this specific key is actually used to validate the token if it exists for all the private routes. That's it. Okay, we have this gateway JWT secret that I will cover in the middleware shortly, and this is also expires in value. So we have this log level, Redis URL, auth service URL, account service URL, and transaction service URL. So all these three services I added in the config, and all this will be booted from the process env object. If it is not resolved, then we are basically falling back to the default constant values as well. Okay, in most of the cases this won't happen. During the deployments also in our local Docker setup, we'll try to have these things in place. Okay, and instead of hard coding, we can actually use the discovery service and all. Again, based on the complexity and the community interest, we can also introduce discovery service, so that instead of hard coding or booting it from the environment variable, we can actually fetch this information from the discovery service, which will be another microservice. Simple. Okay, all right. So if index.ts is clear, now in the config folder, we can actually go with the logger. If you can recollect, we are using Winston library. So let's define the logger.ts file inside the config folder. I'm going to dump the file because it's easy to explain. So over here, if you see, first we are importing the config and we're getting the config object from the root, this specific config folder. Okay, here if you see, winston.createLogger is the method so that we can get the logger instance, and we are passing down the level from the config.log level. So if you see, this config.log level is basically the log level from the process.env. Otherwise it will fall back to info. And over here in the .env, we have this log level as debug. Simple. Okay, so in the logger.ts, we are getting config.log level and pointing that to the level, and we are, so this is important, default meta, if you see service, so we are passing service underscore name. So in this case, this will be resolved to API-gateway, and if you have the auth service with the same config./index.ts file, it will be resolved as auth-service, because in the package.json, of course, you're going to name the value as auth service for the auth service microservice, right? So that's it. And then I basically defined this specific format so that it's easy to debug down the line later if you want to introduce EL key or Grafana low key and so on. So over here we have this format, winston.format.combine. So I'm adding the timestamp, and this is the format basically I'm telling to print it out whenever we use this logger instance. So what is the format? So in the first part, we are using timestamp, which will be wrapped again with square brackets, and then log level and the service name, and then colon. Then we'll be getting the message, whatever you basically do, like logger.info, logger.debug, logger.error, and so on. Okay, that's pretty much it. And basically I'm just exporting that as a default logger instance. That's it. I hope this is clear. And there are two more files we need to create inside the config. One is basically Redis, self-explanatory. This basically makes sure that it will get the Redis instance whenever we need it. I added all the changes required. I'll give a walkthrough of it because it's hardly 50 lines. So Redis client, I'm just creating a class, and as a default, I'm just getting an instance. So it's kind of a singleton. So Redis client over here, if you see, instance over here is the Redis instance, and is connected is false. We are just storing it for an internal tracking. So this method basically gives a proper Redis connection instance. So over here, if you see, Redis client if instance is not there. So even if you call multiple times, it will always refer to a first instance which is created. That's it. So this specific line, new Redis config.redis URL. So this Redis URL again boils down to this specific Redis URL, which is again coming from the .env what you passed over here. Usually for any connection URLs, there is a pattern of username colon password, but for easy development, as it's purely local, I just added the password and it did accept it. So can't remember is the actual password. That's it. Okay. And the port is 67, and that's what we defined in the docker compose.yaml. And also in the env, if you see here, we did pass the can't remember over here. So require pass, and you're passing can't remember. Can't remember is basically the password to access Redis instance. That's it. Okay. And then we have this retry strategies, which is all default. Maximum retries per request is 3. So setup event listeners. If you see here, the setup event listeners is basically just as a loggers if you want. So over here, if you see Redis client.instance. So whenever it get connected, I'm just saving this is connected to true. If you can remember, this is a private field. And we have all the other on error, on close, on reconnecting. So for the error, we are using logger.error. And for the logger.one and for the on close, we are using logger.one. Simple. Okay. I'll show you how these logs will be printed, and is Redis basically is connected. That's it. Okay. So whenever this redis.ts file is required, we'll always get the Redis client connected instance. Simple. Okay. Till this part, if you feel you learned something, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe. Alright, I guess we can resume app.ts to incorporate the new changes. Let's add these two lines where we are getting the config instance and the logger instance. Simple. Okay. And then let's add a simple request logging middleware. As you can see here, it's a very simple basic middleware. We have this request response same next pattern, the middleware pattern, and we are just trying to log it. So logger.debug, because it's a verbose, right? So we can just add debug over here. And this is the I'm just adding the timestamp over here, which is technically not required. Maybe I'll just remove it. Once we start, we'll see that and we'll try to remove that. And then later we have this rec.method and then rec.url. So it's basically just to try to dump a request meta information. Simple. And then of course, let's add the 404 handler over here. And we should always make sure that this should be the last middleware in the order of middlewares. We can still have the error handler middleware where the signature of the middleware is different. So if you see here, over here, app.use, it starts with 4 arguments. So the normal regular middleware will have only 3 arguments. As it's optional, we can just remove. I just removed over here. But if you see, the typical valid middleware is request, response, and the next. Okay. But for the error handling middleware, we have 4 arguments: error, request, response, and the next. That's it. Okay. I'm just adding in logger.error, stating that unhandled error and returning it as safe side 500 internal server error, the classic error. Okay. And as I said, this 404 should be at the very end. This doesn't make sense, so let's move it to the top, maybe right after the request logging. That's it. We defined all the things required in the app.ts. Let's add the code block where it will actually start the service. This is again a very simple function. Start server inside to listen app.listen with the config.port, and I'm printing service name, config.service name. Again, if you can remember, this will be coming from the package.json name, project name. Running on port, config.port. Simple. Okay. And if there is an error, failed to start the server, process.exit. That's it. Okay. And I'm calling this. You can also self-invoke and all, but it's more cleaner and easy to read. Okay. That's pretty much it. I hope till this part it's clear. So overall, I try to cover up. We just created a required config files, index.ts where it loads all the env variables, logger.ts where it will log in a specific pattern and it will return a logger instance, and redis.ts where it is a Redis client instance. So we can use it in our auth middleware that I'm going to cover very soon. Okay. Now app.ts is also clear right now. Let's start with the middlewares. So for that, let's create a folder. Okay, first one, we can have the rate limiting so that we can trace the request based on the IP address, and we can have some specific limitations as well. Let's name the file as rate-limit.middleware.ts. Okay, and the file content is simple. We have this rate limit. We are using Express rate limit package, and this rate limit is basically a middleware, ExpressJS middleware. That's it. So window milliseconds is in milliseconds, basically 15 minutes, right, into 60 seconds and into 1000. Simple. Okay. And maximum value we have is 100, meaning limit each IP to 100 requests per window in milliseconds, basically. So this rate limit will kick in if number of requests crosses more than 100 from a specific IP in a window of 15 minutes. Then it will limit the request. Simple. Okay. Let's rename this file to rate limiter, which is more better. All right, let's use this middleware in the app.ts. Maybe right after over here, app.use limiter. Simple. Let's rearrange to top. That's it. Okay. Till this point, it's a very basic Express service which doesn't actually work as an API gateway, right? Because we just added the health endpoint, 404 handler, error handler, and also request limiting. But till this point, we haven't covered the actual gateway service, right? Like proxying the request. Let's do that as well. Let's start by adding services.ts file in the config. For now, we can just keep it over here, services.ts. Okay. For this, let's add all the required imports over here, and then let's simply define a class service proxy, and inside we'll have a static field of service configs. To get started, we have these three services: auth service URL, account service URL, and transaction service URL. All this again coming from the config value. Okay, so I'll just cover this part. If you see here, there is one undefined. There is a service config interface, and that is coming from the types. It's not defined, so let's add that folder as well. And let's add index.ts. Simple. And this is a very simple interface: service config, path, URL, path rewrite, name, and timeout. So this is basically an array of objects. So path, what we are trying to do is, and if any of the endpoint matches this pattern, like /API/v1/auth, in that case, we'll redirect the request to auth service URL that will be here. And this path rewrite is really important. If you don't maintain this one, it basically always send the request to. So let's say for the auth service, it is localhost 3001. So when this HTTP proxy middleware tries to redirect the request, it will basically end up sending it as a slash. So always it will receive at the auth service as localhost :3000/. That's it. So in order to maintain this specific path as is, we'll use this path rewrite. Okay, and this is exactly where I faced a lot of issues earlier when I was using Express 5. For Express 4, it's kind of a straightforward, but for the Express 5, I figured out that this is the way how it should be handled. Could be due to the middlewares how the request path will be resolved. And the name over here is auth service. This is for basically for the meta information. And timeout, for now I just kept it as 5 seconds for the auth specific, and for the other things it's not required. So that's the reason. If you see here in the types, timeout is optional. That's it. So in the services, right now we just define the service configs, right? So let's complete this class. So I have some helper private functions over here. This specific setup proxy function. So this will be the main function where actually the whole proxy will be booted. So over here, if you see setup proxy, what we are trying to do is we are just simply trying to iterate on the service configs. This one. Okay, we have 3 right now, right? Later, if you get notification service, then overall it will be 4 or a number of microservices. Okay, so here set up proxy service configs for each. What we are trying to do is service proxy dot create proxy options, and you are passing the whole service object. Simple. Okay, so this specific create proxy options will basically return a simple object, and that is in a specific format which is compatible to this HTTP proxy middleware. Simple. Okay, so what is the target URL? Change origin, whether it's required or not. Of course, it's required for us. Path rewrite, timeout if it exists. Otherwise, we are getting from the default timeout, and some handlers over here: error, proxy request, and proxy rest. If you see here, these two handle proxy request and handle proxy response. They are just a placeholder functions. I added as a commented debugger, proxying request to so and so on. Later, if you needed something like if you want to handle anything on the request side or on the response side, we'll do that. But for now, I just added as a placeholders. And then we have this handle proxy error. So if at all, if you receive any error during this proxying, then we'll try to send the response as 503 gateway timeout for now. Later we'll change the code, and also if we need something else, we'll try to do that. But for now, I think this should be enough. So we have this error, proxy error response. We can just create an interface for now, message status and timestamp. Let's do it at the top for now. Or actually we can just move this to the types, right? In the index.ts. Let's do that. Over here. And let's export this one also. That's it. Okay, then we can just remove this one, and also we can just auto import. Simple. Now this is clear. And then once we get the proxy options over here, so this specific line is basically the core line for this entire service.ts file, where it will map for each service. So service.path, if you see here, this will be for each instance on the service config. Path is basically API v1/auth, and for the account service, it will be accounts. Okay, so if you see here in the setup proxy, so for /API/v1/auth, try to get the proxy options and set up that. Create proxy middleware is basically from the HTTP proxy middleware package. So this line is basically the core for the entire API gateway service. In short, I hope this is clear. So this will be iterated 3 times. So for the auth service as /auth, and for the account service as a/API/v1. I'm not just repeating that one, but overall /auth for auth service, /accounts for account service, /transactions for transaction service. So it will configure, and I just added a supporting logger info so that it's easy to understand when we just start the service. And now let's just simply export a simple function proxy services, which will be imported into the app.ts, and we'll just pass the Express app instance, where we are just simply calling setup proxy function, and it will iterate over the service configs and try to set the middleware over here. That's it. Simple. Okay. Now that this specific service.ts file is done, let's import this one as well. So we can add this, I think, exactly after health check endpoint as service routes, and you can just simply call proxy services, and we'll just pass the app instance. That's it. Simple. Let's start this service. I think we have done enough coding right now. Let's see in the first place whether this is even working or not. So first let's switch to API gateway, and then we can just call npm start. That's it. Okay, as you can see here, I'll just open over here. So if you see here, configured proxy for auth service at API/v1/auth. Let me just hide the sidebar. Okay, if you can see here, configured proxy for auth service at API/v1/auth, configured proxy for account service at API-v1/accounts, and for transaction service, it is configured for path API-v1/transactions. Simple. Okay, and at the end we have this API gateway run. And if you observe the log line structure, this is how we configured in the logger.file. If you see here, logger.ts file, the format over here. So first is timestamp wrapped with square brackets over here, and then info, and then API gateway, and which is basically the service name, log level, service name, and the message. Simple. So it will be easy for us to debug anything from the logs. Right now it looks all good, right? So how to test this? So what we'll do, this video is actually planned for just for the API gateway. So for now, what we'll do, we'll just create a dummy auth service folder for now. Okay, and we'll just have the index.js file, not even TS, because again we need this all the TS supporting files and all. So we'll just simply use the HTTP native library and test this out. So let's import that native HTTP library. Okay, and then we can just simply have http.create server request response, and let's just listen it 3001, because this is how we configured, where auth service will listen at 3001, because API gateway will be listening at 3000, auth service is 3001, and the other services basically +1 +1 incrementing. That's it. Okay, and if you can remember, we need to use res.end to basically send the response, and json.stringify. So what we'll do, we'll use one thing as message, hello from API gateway, and maybe URL, so that we can just pass it out, and also headers. So we just return some meta information as a response instead of logging and all. And also, as we're just sending this as a JSON, we should have this res right head. We are setting application JSON as a content type header because we are sending this as a JSON. Simple. And status code is 200. That's it. Okay, I think this is hello API gateway, right? Not the hello from API gateway. And maybe at the end we can just simply have one simple console.log supporting statement. That's it. Okay, now as I mentioned, I'll be using Bruno for this one instead of Postman, because it's lightweight and we can actually save that inside the repository itself, so it's easy to share. Okay, I already created one simple collection vbank. Right now I just have two. API gateway base URL, this is again the local environment variable, similar to the Postman over here. If you see, I just set this as API gateway base URL as localhost 3000. Simple. Okay, now first let's call health. Status is okay. Okay, now we can just have the log also over here. If you see here, debug so and so get health. I think we can remove this line because this will be exactly same as the same timestamp. So let's just update that as well. over here. Yeah. All right. So let's start again. We can use npm run dev, which will basically run it as a watch mode, but I think we already started, so let's trigger it again. Okay, status okay. And then if you see here, API gateway get health. That's it. Okay. Now the fun part. Now if you can guess, what if we just pass this API v1 slash auth slash register? Any guesses? Okay, let's shoot. If you see here, we are getting service unavailable, status 503, timestamp is so and so. The reason it is unavailable, so if you see here, we got this log also, proxy error for connection refused. Over here, if you see, it is trying to access 3001. As we are not even running that service, we got this service unavailable. Simple. Okay, now what we can do, I'll just create a new instance of it, and then let's start. Let's switch to auth service, and let's just simply start no index.js. Simple. Okay, now if you see, auth service is running on port 3000. This is just to again close the loop to make sure that API gateway is working as expected. Okay, now let's simply call now. If you can see here, now we got the response. Okay, message is hello API gateway, URL, what is the URL we requested, and headers. Simple. Okay, we can just pass it anywhere, because as long as this thing matches, it will work. If I just send now, so I got the URL as ASDS. Okay, now if I just change one part, auth1. Okay, any guesses what will be the output? We got resource not found. You might be guessing that it should be service unavailable. Definitely no. The reason is, if you see here, we have set up the proxy in a way that we are setting up only for, let me hide this one a bit. We are setting up only for these three paths which are matching: API v1 auth, or API v1 accounts, or API v1 transactions. If any of these things doesn't match, then basically we are falling back to the 404 error handler, resource not found. Remember, that's it. Okay, now let's simply change this to accounts. Okay, now any guesses? If you see here, service unavailable. As we configured, this should be proxy to a proper account service. As we haven't started the account service, we got the service unavailable. Simple. Okay, so let's me revert this one to auth, and let's this to register. Simple. Okay, so with this testing, it's clear that this API gateway is working as expected. As you can see in the response headers, there are some other important information. If you see here, X rate limit value is 100, X rate limit remaining is 93. Okay, this limiter is basically storing in memory and trying to validate the counter, and based on that, if it crosses 100 within that specific time window of 15 minutes, it will throw an error. So how to test this one? Let's try to first limit that to maybe only 3 requests or 2 requests, let's say, just to quickly test that. So that we can just simply open rate limiter window, and instead of 100, let's call this as 5 simply. Okay, now let's start the other service, or we can just use npm run dev. Okay, API gateway running. Now let's call this request again. Now let's look at the values. So X rate limiting remaining is 4. Now let's start multiple times, 3, 4. Okay, now let's verify. Remaining is 1. Okay, now let's call another one. This will also function, and X rate limit remaining is right now it's 0. So any guesses what is the response if we just send now? We got 429, too many requests. Simple. Too many requests, please try again later. That's it. Okay, so let's reset the value to 100, and if you see, the moment I saved it, it automatically started. Okay, there's a last chunk which I planned for this specific video, that is to cover auth middleware, where it will try to validate the token. Though we don't have the auth service, I thought like we'll just cover that part, but as the video length is already high, let's try to cover that in the next video, maybe along with the auth service. Okay, so right now, to sum it up, we have defined the API gateway where there is no auth layer for now, but still that is fine, because in order to close the loop, I think it's better to have the auth service in the first place. Then we can come back to the API gateway and try to close the loop. So to sum it up, we covered the architecture overview, and then later we started the API gateway development. We started with a very basic app.ts, and then later we tried to have the config files like logger, index.ts and Redis and also services. The services is basically where exactly the heart of the API gateway, where it will try to configure based on the specific paths to a specific microservices. And we have this rate limiter middleware. We also tested this one by simply reducing the max value. And also, if you can recollect, we created the Redis instance. We're actually not using the specific file in the video because this is actually used in the auth middleware, where it will be trying to connect it to the Redis. No worries, we'll start with the auth service. Once we complete the auth service, we'll try to come back to the API gateway and close the loop on the auth middleware. More clear and easy to understand. Now about the code sharing. So what I'm thinking is I'll just give 1 week of buffer for the community so that they can try it out on themselves, and then exactly after the 7 days on the next following week I will add a comment with the necessary repo link along with the branch so that you guys can refer and see and compare, and also you can actually share your thoughts, and if there are any improvement areas feel free to drop a comment so that we can basically learn together and try to improve this whole project. And also this is the very first video in the implementation detail, so along with this video I will attach a 01 branch repository link and make it public so that where you can get this base template service so that you don't need to scratch your head to define all this ts config and all, and also maybe a package.json file so that it's easy to get started. And then later exactly after 7 days I'll actually share this specific code so that in this 1 week you can try to develop on yourself and then later fall back to my code as a reference. I hope this video is helpful and you learned something new. If so, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe, which will motivate me to do more interesting videos. That's it for this video. Thank you so much for watching and I'll see you in the next one.